looking at a runner in your office laying on a table and then not watching them run, you know, that's insane, right? But we all do that. It's like, oh, I'll address this, and I can't tell you how many clients come in and say, oh, no one ever watched me run, and you think, well, we're maybe missing the fundamental component of what you do and what might be creating this irritation. Anybody who watches Gait, yeah, I mean, you can see a hip turn out or these kind of things, but your frame refresh rate, so to speak, of the brain and the eye is not fast enough for the cycle speed of the movement. So nobody's that good. If we're centrally effed up, then peripherally the information is denied. Before I can add velocity, I need to know where I am in space, right? So if I can improve my position sense, if you will, or my map, or whatever you want to call it, and then I can start to add function, I think we see better long-term changes. It's so good for us, right? I mean, you could look at all the neurologic things that even walking does, right? And we can't bank it. I mean, we can't put it in a savings account and take it out later. So clearly there's a reason we need it every day, right? And yet we're so resistive to doing it every day.
Welcome to this new episode. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our sponsor for the podcast, Moxy Monitor. If you've been following my work, you know that the Moxy is a tool that I use a lot for testing, but also for everyday training and coaching. For those who don't know about the Moxy Monitor yet, it's a NIRS device that measures muscle oxygen saturation and blood volume in real time. It's a non-invasive sensor that is placed on the skin and can be worn during any training or sporting activity. Motocross riders and climbers wear it on their forearms. Hockey players on the ice, swimmers can wear it in water. I've used it to test rugby players, CrossFit athletes, endurance athletes, and more. The Moxy allows you to individualize work and rest periods, optimize load, reps and sets, identify training thresholds in real time, and even correct movement based on what the data shows you. You can also use the Moxy Monitor to determine an athlete's energetic limiting factor and their individual training zones. Using this process, I can now target the athlete's limiter with precision in order to improve their performance without adding unnecessary volume to their program. You can view and collect the data on your Garmin watch and can also pair the Moxy with other physiological testing products such as the VO2 Master, Pnoe, and Cosmed VO2 systems. The Moxy is a product I've been using for many months with great success, and I highly recommend it to any coach who's interested in digging a little bit deeper on the physiological side of health, fitness, or performance. You can use the coupon UPSIDE at checkout for a 5% discount on moxymonitor.com/shop. That's UPSIDE, UPSIDE, for a 5% discount. With that said, let's get into the show. Okay, Doc, we're finally live on the podcast. It's been a while since we've been trying to get together and have this chat, so I'm glad we could make it work. How you doing?
Too. I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Nick, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself as we get started here?
Absolutely. I'm a chiropractor. I practice in Denver, Colorado. I think this August is my 22nd year.
Wow.
And I love my profession. I'm not trying to throw them under the bus, but I think we have a very different approach than a traditional sort of chiropractic office.
Okay.
Have a full-time athletic trainer that works with me. And so we sort of team see our patients, and we have a lot of tech, and we do a lot of rehab I teach for a group called Functional Neuro Orthopedic Rehab, but our approach in the office is to really see if we can't leverage the nervous system to improve our results from a rehab perspective. So other than that, I've had some cool opportunities, like pretty much everyone on your podcast, to meet some neat people and do some fun stuff. And so I feel very fortunate to still be at it and interested in it, really.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about chiropractics. If you had to steelman the discipline of chiropractics as it's maybe practiced more widely, and then describe your approach to it in a bit more detail, what would you say?
Sure. Yeah. So the first thing, and I hate to do this to start a podcast, we don't even know each other, but there's no S on it. So it's chiropractic.
Thanks for correcting me. I appreciate it.
And it's a silly thing, but it's like chiropractory, and it sounds like sorcery or something, And,
it's not, honestly, it's good, because like I was telling you just before we started recording, I learned a tremendous amount from my podcast, and I expect not only my guests, but also the listeners to point out either inaccuracies or mistakes, because I think I'm in it to try and get better, and I hope everyone is too. So I think there's no problem in finger pointing and trying to finger pointing in the good sense of the word.
Well, it's just an S on the, and hopefully you'll learn more in this podcast than that. But So traditionally chiropractic was founded, well over 100 years ago on sort of this guy who couldn't hear, and he got adjusted supposedly, and his hearing came back, and here we are, right? So you have sort of two main camps in chiropractic. You have one that is very tied to the adjustment, and it's the end all be all. And all they want to do is that. In fact, maybe they don't even want to be held accountable for diagnosis, even though here in the US, we're considered primary care docs and we diagnose, order MRIs, et cetera. And then you have another group that sort of splits from that, and I sort of fall into that. And we try to do more. We don't believe it's just all about the joint being out of place, so to speak, which doesn't exist to begin with. So philosophically, there's, if we could ever just get together as a profession, we would be unbelievable, but we just kill our own selves. So in my office, yes, we adjust a fair bit, but the idea is to try to change the afferent input from an area, or to try to change a side of the body that might give a better stimulus to the brain, or an area that seems restricted. But from that, then anytime you see me, then you'll go see my athletic trainer, and she'll drive a pretty specific agenda. And from a rehab perspective, our belief is just that rehab isn't intense enough to actually change anything. And so we think philosophically, and it's not just my thought, it's some of the guys that have helped influence me, that, a 3 sets of 10 of something or whatever, I'm not sure how that translates to an ultra marathon. And so we have a very different approach. When you come into our office, we always evaluate Gait. We have a 3D sort of biomechanics lab with plantar pressure treadmill, force plates, inertial movement unit, sensors, high-speed cameras. And so we look at everybody walk, and from Gait, independent of your problem, although I'm not going to force you into, if you can walk, we'll walk you, mostly because everybody walks, right? It's uniquely human. It's primarily subcortical, so it's pretty reflexive. And so you get a very good or pure window into how somebody controls a hip, or how much ankle dorsiflexion, or the kind of things that maybe when you ask them to consciously drive, they engage that frontal lobe, and they start to, show you something different. So Gait on everybody. And then from there, it's just, it depends, right? What the condition is and what's going on.
I guess it's interesting that you say that, because it's something I've been talking about on a few podcasts recently, is the idea that if it was as simple as just having a flow chart and then saying, if this, then that, we wouldn't be here. And
Absolutely.
and we would have figured out the human body a long time ago, but it's not. And so I like the idea that you have a starting point, which is Gait, and then who knows? And then it really depends on the
absolutely.
person.
And, it's not about being right. It's what works for us. But Gait is something that we do. I mean, so as humans, you think we're bipedal. That's unique to begin with. We don't have a tail. So this upright thing is pretty interesting compared to other animals, especially any that are on two legs. And it's something we all do. So as a activity of daily living, then it's an interesting window into how, and it could be an interesting attempt to, or opportunity to rehab somebody as well. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's why we probably lean so heavily on it, because, you can only maybe get so much out of a sit to stand or something. You don't do that 10,000 times a day, but we're all encouraged to take that many steps, right? So for us, that without being in a system still is a really good place to watch somebody move.
Mm-hmm. Is that something you've always held at this, maybe not the center, but the beginning of your process with a patient, or did you have maybe a different view of chiropractic when you started out?
Absolutely. So I think people have, it's a great question. And I think many have been to manual muscle testers, possibly that. And in fact, I know in the strength and conditioning world, there's a few techniques that have getting a lot of traction in the manual muscle testing world, and you rub aggressively some areas, et cetera. So there was a technique called applied kinesiology, and I grew up seeing a doc that did that, and that influenced me. So originally my evaluation was looking at muscles of Gait, because applied kinesiology has a Gait idea to it, but not really watching it, right? And then, it was one of these aha moments where you realize that, looking at a runner in your office laying on a table and then not watching them run, that's insane, right? But we all do that. It's like, oh, I'll address this. And I can't tell you how many clients come in and say, oh, no one ever watched me run. And you think, well, we're maybe missing the fundamental component of what you do and what might be creating this irritation. So I got connected in with a guy by the name of Gary Gray, and he's a movement. He has a whole movement technique, and that really helped flip my head a bit for sure. Because, you know, if you've studied with Gary at all or heard some of the things he says, you know, he's all about three-dimensional movement and this idea of muscles lengthening before they shorten, which is, as we know, they occur, but sort of not classically how we're taught muscle anatomy, right? We think origin, insertion, and action.
Yeah, levers and pulleys.
Right. And then suddenly you're thinking, well, hold on, how's the soleus a knee extender? Or in a push-up, a bicep could actually be extending the elbow. That's really counterintuitive, right? So he really helped flip that. Around that time, there's a group actually out of Italy called Gait, and they make these timing devices. I forget which they make, but nonetheless, they also make these tracks called Gait or OptaJump. I don't know if you've seen them.
I've heard that. Yeah.
So you can lay out meters of the track and link them together, kind of like a railroad track, if you will, or you can get a 3 yard, put it on either side of a treadmill, and it beams LEDs across and creates, if you will, a curtain of light. And so you get all this spatial temporal parameters of gait. Okay. So I started to use that, 2 cameras in that. And then, you know, it's sort of like, well, is what I'm seeing happening, right? Because you start to ask that question. And I know you're into Moxie, as am I, and that was one of those aha moments as well. It's like, well, wait a minute, heart rate's telling me this, but what's going on at the muscle level? So you hear all these claims, and there's lots of techniques out there that claim X, Y, and Z, PRI being one. And I'm not knocking PRI, I've not taken it, I've seen lots of it, but I struggle with the table test being reflective of something. It's like, let's measure it. And so that sort of just was the transition into measuring these things. And then I got connected with the guys with FNOR, that functional neuro orthopedic rehab, and a PT out of Savannah by the name of Stu Fife. And he was really into Gait, and it sort of just helped then even refine that process more for me.
What has changed the most for you in how you view Gait since you started to focus on it?
Well, I would say that it's far less complicated than we need to make it.
That's good to hear. It's encouraging.
Yeah, that's what's changed the most. I mean, I used to get fussed about what's going on at the subtalar joint in relation to the midfoot and what's the relative motion there and blah, blah, blah.
So how do you describe it now? What is the running gait? How should it look? What is a good running gait?
Well, that's a good, so running actually it seems a little easier than walking, really. But so we look at some critical angles because there's tons of research on Gait, right? So we have normative data. We don't have that in throwers and a variety of other things. So I can quickly measure, let's say in mid stance, your pelvic drop, and know how it correlates to what we'd like to see, right? So if we want to see 3 to 5 degrees or 5 to 7 degrees of, let's say, hip adduction in running, and we see 17, then in spite of there not being a problem, I know that there is an issue of pelvic control going on there, right? And we need to then come up with a strategy on how to address it. So, but without measuring things, I mean, from a running standpoint, I think there's some cool research on noise, right? So if somebody's noisy and they just asked people to run quieter and they saw a significant change in vertical loading rate. So, I mean, if you listen to somebody run, cadence is huge, and there's a huge component to that. The vertical load. So if you look at the tibial angle of inclination, you can just eyeball that. But if it's not mostly vertical, that's problematic. So those sort of things you could just look at pretty quickly, vertical oscillation without, with just a general camera and not even measuring, and get a good sense of running issues.
When you talked about the tibia, is that when you establish contact with the ground?
At initial contact. So it should be vertical-ish or 7 degrees or less, but without measuring it, you're just sort of looking for vertical. But otherwise, there's some interesting research, just that acceleration that has to make. So if you have an accelerometer or something on there, that a lot of that can create some massive injuries. So bone stress type stuff or ligamentous, et cetera.
Out of all the tech that you use to assess Gait, for you, which one is the most useful? Which one gives you the most information that is then actionable in your process?
Well, and I have to say, I mean, it's not, I don't have, I say this, obviously, it was by design. My wife and I never wanted children. So my my tech is my child kind of. So I'm lucky to have a lot of it and have a wife that doesn't fuss too much about me, buying more. So my Naraxon system, they're a company that has, they've created a software that then links things. So we have high-speed cameras, Burtec force plates, a pressure bed treadmill, EMG, and then these IMUs. And when you hit go, they all sync. So immediately the report is real time with data. So very quickly, if I hook you up, which doesn't take very long, and we have you do anything, I can real time then look at that at let's say load response. If I want a certain amount of knee flexion in a post-op knee or an ACL and I'm not seeing it, it's not something I can eyeball. And don't kid yourself. And this is not meant to be contentious, but anybody who watches Gait, yeah, I mean, you can see a hip turn out or these kind of things, but your frame refresh rate, so to speak, of the brain and the eye is not fast enough for the cycle speed of the movement. So nobody's that good. I mean, I don't care how, I mean, you see people line it up and they're like, it's like, it kind of makes me laugh because unless they're filming it and slowing it down, it's moving too fast. So my Naraxon, I have to say, it's a very expensive system, but the speed at which I can acquire data and make it actionable is amazing.
With all your years of practice, have you seen certain patterns emerge in terms of issues with people's walking gait that you can almost like pinpoint and say, okay, that's, this bucket. And now you kind of have already maybe the first 2 or 3 steps to move forward. And if so, what are they?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and in fact, you could almost name a condition and I could give you what I'm going to try to, so it's not what I expect to see, but it's what I'm going to make sure isn't there.
Okay.
Right. Because as you know, we all have a confirmation bias. And so then it's like, am I just always seeing this and this? And can I be sure that I'm trying to be objective, looking first in these most obvious places? So without a doubt, across the board, inability to have frontal plane control. That is across the board. Now I see a unique population generally of people who have something going on. Okay. But it is so rare that I see somebody who has appropriate frontal plane control of their pelvis. So hip adduction, for example, is always.
So you see too much of it. You would see too much of it in Gait.
Correct. When you see too little, a few things come to mind, or the right amount, and I still have to prove it out, right? So in Gait, we're looking at sort of a motor control thing. So you're saying, is it the right amount? Are they controlling it? Or if it's little, is it just that they have the range on the table or elsewhere, but they don't access it when they're upright, right? And you have to have other tests to try to corroborate that. But generally speaking, it's excessive in motion, and it's something that when we address, and so sometimes it does feel like, at least in the U.S., we have this. I'm an old man at this point, but there used to be a commercial of Dunkin' Donuts, if you're familiar with that. And the guy's
familiar with the donuts, maybe not the.
But he's up at like 3 a.m. and he's like, he says, making the donuts, and it's like the same morning every morning, But I would say there is a similarity for sure, which is that we are chasing pelvic control on just about everybody.
Okay, and is there a common thread to that endeavor in terms of like what is lacking?
Yeah. So again, I'm going to get slayed on here, I'm sure, but I absolutely believe
that's exactly why you're here, Doc. Go ahead.
Totally. No, maybe not by you, but by one person who listens, maybe by all the pain science guys. So I say that jokingly. I mean, pain science is, a good thing. Yeah, I think actually the glutes don't function very well on lots of people, 100%. So, and I know people, oh, it's not the glute, that's ridiculous. No, I test it. I see it every day. I mean, people say this, but it's like, how are they looking at it? And when we strengthen them appropriately, and we have some different, I think, ways in which we do that are very non-traditional, but we get some really phenomenal results. And that's where I think the 3 sets of 10 plays out in a way that doesn't make sense to me, right? So I think, the key component is that posterior hip musculature and the lateral. So it's a glute med, glute max, and if you, not to dive, I mean, I don't want to pretend. I have some colleagues who are just far, I love hanging out with them. They're far smarter around neuro than I am. But if you do look at the cerebellum, And this is sort of philosophically some of how we approach things. But if you think of it as, pretty important in motor control and I mean, among other things, but predicting movement, efferent copy, looking at timing coordination. When we're drunk, all of our motor tests are cerebellar, right? So when you look at the nuclei in the cerebellum, the midline nuclei, and if you believe in evolution, then the idea is that we evolved from the bottom up in the brain and the midline out. So if you look at the structures, sort of the oldest structures are midline, right? And what do those midline structures control? Well, eye movements, respiration, a lot of these autonomic functions, these automatic functions, right? Which is, not a segue into breathing or anything, but it's pretty cool when you can link that to then, spinal control and these kind of things. But they're all midline. So that midline nucleus, the fastigial nucleus in the cerebellum is spinal erector. It's upright. It's your vestibulospinal reflexes, right? But the very next nuclei out are shoulders and hip, and then it's sort of elbows and then hands and knees. So if we look even at the hierarchy of how the brain's organized in our rehab, it's if somebody comes in with a foot, I'm absolutely going to address the foot. But as an order of how we're laid out neurologically, I better make sure they have proximal control, right? So that's also why that hip control is so important to us.
Yeah, it's funny you talked about the proximal. It just what came into my mind is I believe it's from PRI. It's the proximal stability and distal mobility type of.
Yeah, there's a
idea.
lot. Like I know Gary Gray has this mobile table.
Yeah.
Again, I haven't taken PRI, and
I haven't either. I'm not kidding anybody. I'm just
it's not that. From what I hear from it, it's just hasn't been that interesting to me. But here's what I struggle with from what I understand about PRI is I'm not sure what a sideline table test has to do with anything, and that's one of the tests. I'm not sure. I mean, when I've had PRI people in here and we re-walk them, I don't see the changes. So I'm not sure what a right AIS or a left AIS or whatever most people have. I'm not sure what that means in true gait because they're using a table test to tell me what it means, not a movement test, right?
Yep.
But then the other bit, if we get like way down a rabbit hole, is, and this is, courtesy of originally probably Ted Carrick, who's a functional neuro guru, and then Dave Traster, Dr. Traster, who good buddy, who has introduced me to these thought processes. But if we're centrally effed up, then peripherally the information is a mess. So, and it's a peripheral based model, right? So the question is, if I don't know where I am in relation to gravity, so to speak, and I have a otolithic vestibular integration issue, then I may not have the best position sense of where my hand is in space, or my leg, and so I'm doing all these peripheral corrections without checking something centrally. And so it's a hard one for me because it's so heavily weighted to peripheral bias of a position.
Yeah.
And you just wonder if we're maintaining a peripheral bias due to a central integration issue. So that's always a struggle for me too, because maybe peripherally we're that way for a reason.
Yeah.
I mean, especially if 90 some odd % of us are, it's like, well, that's weird. I mean, if everyone's that way, is that we all like the 7% or, or the other way, but or anyway, so sorry to digress, but it's the musings that I think about when I'm evaluating these other techniques.
Yeah, definitely don't apologize. So if we go back to the glutes, what's wrong with our glutes, Doc?
Yeah, well, they're amnesic. No, I'm kidding. I know people hate that.
You're just making a lot of friends right now.
Right, totally. Well, I mean, the reality is, it's like, let's play. Like let's banter ideas around, and let's instead of being contentious with each other, like let's share ideas. Let's say, try this and tell me what you see. So generally speaking, I think we know in chronic pain, and that's most of what I see, and to define chronic pain is sort of complicated. It used to be a timeline, but now we know that there's more to it, and it may not require the same timeline we once assumed it did. But there's some really
can you maybe give an idea of those two timelines?
Yeah, well, they used to think, it's like if you've had pain over 8 to 10 weeks, right? It sort of falls into chronic. And it chronic because we start to now see certain things occur, like central sensitization in the brain, and long-term potentiation of certain things that lead to then a normal input being perceived as noxious, right? So we have to be careful, because then chronic pain scenarios are sort of sometimes misrepresenting tissue damage. So in the absence but we still perceive the pain pattern, right? And it's protective initially, right? I mean, it makes sense that our nervous system protects. It's just how and why. And so as we look at injuries, and this is sort of how we rehab them, and I will answer your question about glute strength, or what we do is, we know that the motor cortex and the sensory cortex, these maps have been shown to smudge and shrink in chronic pain. And so we know the quality of feedback and the timing of feedback has been altered. And that's really important, because then when you start to look at studies, and again, I'm very clear about this, I don't do research. Not because I'm opposed to it or anything else. I think it's brilliant. I love people that do. If you want to be, the problem with everything having to be peer reviewed is it's hard to be cutting edge, right? So you start to get experimental in your office, but if you waited for the research to catch up, you'd be waiting, right?
Yeah.
And
well, you have to have some practice in order to form a hypothesis that you're then going to test. So it has to start on the field. Or in maybe a thinking group or something, but it has to start with a practical side, right?
And the thing about that's so that's so important for me around that process is the idea that when you look at then research, and this is where I'm extrapolating, right? So I can show you lots of studies on, like, so let's say shoulder rehab, and they take a group and they say this group did rehab, this group didn't. This group statistically all got stronger, but then when they measured muscle function and task function, that there wasn't an improvement. So they got stronger in the exercise, but the task didn't change, right? And the question is, well, did the exercise facilitate a change in the brain to the level to change the smudging, right? So, or is it that we got stronger here, and yes, maybe some changes, but we didn't do enough to intensity, whatever, to change the map, right? So when in this chronic pain scenario, we know that generally speaking, we're going to see these altered maps, right? We also know that, and this sort of goes back to a lot of what you've discussed around the metaboboral reflex and these kind of things, or metaboral reflex, is that we know that spindle cells, their density is greatest generally in areas of the greatest amount of blood supply. And spindle cells are really important for proprioception.
Can you remind us of their role?
Yeah, so I mean, they monitor tension, right? So you have Golgi tendon organs at sort of the distal ends, and then spindle cells in the middle of the muscle, and the spindle cell is monitoring tension, and that tension change is giving you constant feedback about where you are in space. I mean, that's a simple way to think about, but it's important, because how do I know if my wrist is here or here, right? Or how do I know that I need to, at some range, engage a certain amount of tension through the muscle and what I'm doing? So, but that proprioception is really important, because if we are now shitty breathers, right, or struggle with breathing during exercise, or we're getting chronic back pain, what you see is you'll shunt the blood to the diaphragm, right? Preferentially, we know that. And there's some cool research to support that. And so you start to get less proprioceptive density in those lumbar spine, those paraspinals. And so now you're dealing with a proprioceptive issue in the spine as well. So when you then look at who has leverage over the pelvis, I mean, it's only really one muscle group, right? And it's yes, your abdominals, but it's your glutes. And your glutes are about the only thing that can take you out of a position of anterior significant. Now, I don't believe in malpositions or, up slip or down slip, that kind of stuff. That's hard for me. But the idea that we see it, I mean, Raheem Sterling, if you watch soccer or something, would be an extreme example on Man City of that massive altered costopelvic relationship, right? So what muscle group has the leverage there? The glutes. And so what we see is when you have this chronic pain, we think that there's smudging in the brain. The glute, if you look at some of Chris Power's work, and again, extrapolating, he thinks that, there's a lot of redundancy built around the hip, and the glute is one of the first ones to sort of decide to be less functional. Mm-hmm. And so
do we have an idea why?
We don't. I mean, again, it's a really good question. Maybe we sit all the time. I mean, we could all argue these things, right? I mean, yeah. But regardless, and maybe it's that we don't do the level of activity that we need to be doing generally. I mean, it's so strange about physical activity, right? We can, at least this is my silly musings on it, but it's so good for us, right? I mean, you could look at all the neurologic things that even walking does, right? And we can't bank it. I mean, we can't put it in a savings account and take it out later. So clearly there's a reason we need it every day, right? And yet we're so resistive to doing it every day. And so you just wonder if some of it is about this adaptation that's occurred over time. I don't know. Some of it is about you have many muscles across that area that can do similar functions. And so unless you are then sprinting or doing high speed things that require demands of stability while you're getting distal mobility, I don't know. Regardless, it's what we see, And so the other bit is that although they're not motor nerves, if we take the glutes, for example, there's some really big nerves down there called your cluneal nerves. And they get sensitized. So from what's called a peripheral neurogenic inflammation, but we'll see cluneal nerve irritation all the time. And although there's sensory nerves and their distribution is really from sort of T12 down into the buttock. So when people come in and complain of that sort of pain, the first thing I'm going to rule out is whether there's some cluneal nerve irritation. If there is, then we know that even though they're not motor, our observation is they affect motor function. So now you have this pain pattern that is going on all the time in that area. And a lot of people we know have back pain. In fact, if you look at chronic low back pain, it's really a big issue to the medical system. And so if we have this chronic irritation and it creates that cycle of chronic inhibition as a protective mechanism, maybe the glutes are just what are suffering the most there as the paraspinals tighten to protect shear, because we talked about the cerebellum, that midline, right? We want strength, stability, midline. So we'll do anything to reduce shearing in the lumbar spine, and we get inhibition of the posterior hip musculature. So at least that's sort of my working model on it.
Yeah. And so when we talk about and we are working with a broad avatar, let's say we don't have a person in mind, but from that standpoint, again, do you have some key exercises or approaches that you're going to try and, or I guess interventions that you're going to try and put in place in order to reestablish that motor control activation, even though that's probably the word that people are not going to like in that context either. Is it mini bands around the knees, Doc?
Well, so look, so here's the thing is we teach this court, and I'm kidding. But not.
That was good. That was good.
But in all honesty, the first thing is I'm gonna try to change the neurogenic inflammation. So if this isn't a sales pitch, but there's a topical that's phenomenal called Prologel.
Yeah.
So it's based on something called neuroprolotherapy, injecting dextrose into peripheral nerves.
I think I've heard of prolotherapy. I think Joe Rogan talks about it.
Yeah. So
he had a couple of guests that.
So prolotherapy is a little different. You're injecting ligaments to try to create hypertrophy and stability.
Oh, no. You know what? The physio that I went to see in Vancouver way back suggested it for the low back issues that I had at the time. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, these peripheral nerves are really close to the skin. So, I mean, some smart dudes realized you could create a topical that has a sugar solution in it, a bicarbonate, because the nerves are super sensitive to changes in tissue pH. And that topical works a charm. So the first thing is, if there's neurogenic inflammation, we have to stop that cycle, because if the perception by the brain is that there's more damage than is going on, then it sort of doesn't seem to matter what we do exercise wise. Well, that's not untrue, but we need to still deal with the pain that creates the constant inhibition.
Yeah.
So if we can manage that, so that's one of the first things we'll look at. And then for us, we're trying to change maps. So we start with well, let's assume that this is the avatar of the person who we saw in Gait had terrible frontal plane issues, and it's relative to whatever, a knee or a back. Then the idea for us is how do we remap the posterior hip, right? So what exercises are mostly that and nothing else, right? And so we many times will use a clamp and a band around the ankles, but our application of the exercise is so profoundly different. So, we'll try to create plasticity. And so if you look at like Halo headphones or a lot of other research on creating plasticity, the stimulus needs to be upwards of 15 to 20 minutes. So we may have people doing 20-minute isometrics, right? So we just
how does that feel?
It's amazing, actually. So it's not uncommon to, get off the table and jump around and feel like I could dunk a basketball right now. I mean, because it's such a neurologic stimulus as well. The humor is, you can take a high-level athlete and he'll give me 2 minutes, and you're like, okay, this is problematic.
Okay. Is there a certain band tension that you use? Is there any modifications that you bring to the position itself? Any specifics?
Yeah. So we always, it depends on who I'm working with, right? So if it's someone that I like and is not that much of an ego, then yeah, we're going with the light with the band that makes sense to the data we saw, which is usually lighter, right? But if I have an athlete, absolutely, I'm pulling out like whatever they use in their training, a blue band or a black band, right? Just to show them, and they're tapping out. And then I say, oh, do you want me to slip the yellow one on? I'm sort of bantering, but also trying to show them that maybe what they were doing wasn't creating the change their perception was. Yeah, the real feedback is to make sure they're not living in their back, right? That's the trick for us.
Kind of again. Well, so, I'm going to go there with you, waking up the glutes.
Well, this is it. But the reality is, it's really, we're trying to remap it, right? And so if we want to call it waking up,
I'm sorry to cut you off here. You've been talking about maps, and I read this great book a while back about the brain maps. I forget the name, and you probably know all the names of all the books. It's one that's fairly accessible.
That's true.
Do you have one off the top of your head that's fairly accessible?
No. In fact, if you do, I'd love to hear about it.
I've been trying to remember what the title was, and I just can't for the life.
I could link you to some of the research, but it was originally done in the low back. But that is the idea. Is amnesic, whatever. And I laugh because, we'll end up on Adam Meekins or something, and he'll call us out. But then I'll just put a band on him and see if he can do 20 minutes of glute isos and see how he feels. Kidding. So, but I don't think it's so black and white, right? And so nonetheless, once someone gains some control, then we start to drive function. And so I've always struggled with this idea of something being functional, right? Like, what does that mean? And I think Ray Cook, I'm totally misquoting him, but he says something like the functional exercise is what's right for that person in that moment. I like that idea. But most people will tell you that a clamshell isn't functional, and most of the functional guys would pretend that they'd never do that in their life. My argument is, if you have a shitty map and now you're upright moving around, how do you know you're not just the volume from the quad and the hammy and everyone else is high? You may increase the glute, but it's only relative. And so what's more functional than improving actually my integration of position sense, right? Because before I can add velocity, I need to know where I am in space, right? So if I can improve my position sense, if you will, or my map or whatever you want to call it, and then I can start to add function, I think we see better long-term changes. So that's why for me, it's, we can argue function all day long, but I do smile when I hear somebody poo-poo laying around with the band, because I think, well, laying around with the band and doing 3 sets of 10, yeah, all day long, every day. It seems ridiculous. I'm not sure what the stimulus is. You're off tension longer than you're on tension. It just doesn't make sense.
Well, for me, going back to what you just said, function is predicated on a task to accomplish. And so depending on what you want to accomplish, then you can deem something to be functional or not. And like you said, tools, they're all tools, right? And you just have to apply the right tool at the right time in the right context.
And have a why.
And have a why. Yeah.
And you hope the why isn't because I listened to a podcast between Sean and Studholme and decided that, he said it, right? And I think, unfortunately, the why is too much that. It's like, well, and again, whether it's, and I've taken lots of, in chiropractic, there's these techniques like turn your head one way, the leg shifts, I click here, turn here, click here. And I think, why? And they're like, well, that's what the course told me. Right.
Uh-huh.
And it's like, that's not enough. Right. It just isn't enough. We need to be much more discerning and questioning. Right.
And so once you've been, let's keep building on that idea. Once you've been able to reestablish some control, maybe get that map to take up a little bit more real estate in the brain. What's the next step? How do you, let's say, integrate that further into functional movement like walking or running?
Well, absolutely. So again, for us, I mean, one of the things that we'll always look at is what's going on down at the foot, right? And so we know that you can measure, and we do on every patient, toe strength. There was a simple dynamometer you can buy and measure toe strength, and you should be able to generate 10% of your body weight under your great toe and 7% under your lesser. And we see lots of, and especially it seems like the higher the level your function, the less toe strength you have. And when I say toe, I mean not only toe, but obviously those muscles cross into the lower leg. Mm-hmm. And at all speeds of running, those of you that know me probably have heard me say this 1,000 times, but any idea what muscle sort of does the most work, generates the most torque independent of speed? I'm asking, do you have any?
Can you say that again?
Yeah, so at all speeds of running, do you have any idea which muscle does the most work or generates the most torque at any speed?
I remember this great presentation on Strength Coach Network. I'll give them a shout out because it's a fantastic educational platform for coaches that's done. What was it? It's the big toe. It's definitely the big toe.
It's not, but it's not a bad guess, you know?
So let me try and get to the end of my thought process. Not that you cut me off or anything, but
I apologize.
No. You're not. Don't apologize. There was that just that lower leg, that stiffness. There was definitely an ankle component to the way that you can just transfer forces through the ground, and what they saw in terms of. I thought it was around. It was definitely. And I guess that's kind of a cop out, but it was somewhere around below the knee, which is not very helpful. But
so if you flex your lower leg, however you choose to do that, what muscle is making up the majority of the meat there?
Flex my lower leg.
Like, so if you were to say flex your calf, what muscle is actually making up the majority of that meat?
Isn't that the calf itself?
It's your soleus.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the soleus is the muscle that does more work at any speed.
Okay, yeah.
And the reason that's important is because we're going to check that and train it, but also because if we look at single leg stance in walking, not so much running, but in walking, the only muscles that are really EMG active are at the hip and the lower leg.
Okay.
So our upright progressions, then we want to be sure that we've established integrity of the foot and ankle, right? And that they have appropriate strength. And so we do a lot of foot and ankle and toe strengthening. Yeah. And then we do integrated movements to drive a hip foot strategy.
Okay. So it's kind of a two-pronged approach at almost the two ends of the leg,
and that's
so to speak.
And that's sort of why I long-wind it a little bit is we rarely see a foot without a hip or vice versa.
They go together.
But regardless,
shocking.
I mean, right? Imagine, and you'd be surprised how much toe flexor weakness exists, and how profoundly changing it can make a difference. So how much
do shoes play into that? For the human species as a whole?
Well, so, I have today, oddly enough, I have my New Balance Fresh Foams on, but normally I'm in my Vivos, and I love the barefoot shoe. I just don't love them for running. They don't make a lot of sense for me there.
Why is that?
Well, because unless you're running really short distances, most of us don't have the integrity. Even evolutionary, the size of the metatarsal heads has shrunk over time. So this idea that we're meant to be barefoot, I sort of struggle with because we've changed that evolutionary. If you look at and a shout out to Tom Michaud, who if you're interested in a biomechanics book, he has the greatest, they called Human Locomotion, but the opening bits on evolution, and he'll go through the evolutionary changes of the foot. It's really interesting. but the width of the bones is narrower. So we're not even designed to maybe be as in this environment barofoot as much. So
not as much,
yeah.
but some. Do you think it is
Maybe.
important from a proprioceptive standpoint? Is there some
Yeah.
value to spending more time outdoors without any shoes?
I think you could do it indoors, walking around your house. I mean, I think, again, I'm looking at barriers to my patient's life.
Yeah.
Right. And most people aren't going to take their shoes off and walk around outside. They're just not. For lots of reasons. Dog poop, dog pee, whatever. I mean, they're just.
If they did, would you tell them to?
It wouldn't be my first thing. I'd tell them to just strengthen their toes. Yeah.
Do you have some preferred way? I remember that really great video from Andrew Espina. You're probably familiar with the man, FRS.
Absolutely.
And the whole intrinsic foot strengthening. Is there some additional facets that you would apply to foot strengthening?
Absolutely. Because I think what that video begins is motor control, but the strength component I think is questionable. Like you can develop a little endurance in those range, but I'm not sure how standing there doing an isometric translates to then my body weight translating over the foot, right? And as we're translating over a foot, we need those toes to stiffen as a lever arm to propulse us. So again, shout out to Tom. He created a device called a Toe Pro. And it's really clever because there's some cool research to show if you have 10 degrees of toe dorsiflexion, you get 4 times the strength gains. So his is all pitched appropriately, the wedge. And so then we do our toe and foot exercises using this wedge. And patients are so much more compliant because they toss it on the floor and they can just step up to it and then, stiffen their toes or do calf raises while their toes are being engaged. And it's really, to me, revolutionized my toe strengthening in the office and compliance. And so Tom's a good buddy and he's fun. He sends me prototypes of everything. I feel very fortunate. He's such a creative dude. But from what I understand, every NBA team now has these, this kind of thing. And that always makes me smile. But of all the things, and I don't push product on people, but you need something to make a change, right? So I sell at the cost of the website. We've sold 500 maybe. I mean, we move through these. They're amazing. So that's a preferred way in which we can do foot and toe strengthening. And so I like Spina's work because, you're working on motor control and this kind of stuff. But from a push-off standpoint, I think, how do we then strengthen it?
Yeah, it's like building the map and now you have to strengthen
the map.
Yeah.
So if we curl toes around something that's just, again, back to function, we don't curl our toes in a strength way, right? We stiffen them. So if I have a way to engage them, we'll hook up stim sometimes, and we'll have people we'll stim the foot and the lower leg while they're doing their exercises. If we have a really recalcitrant case.
Okay, I've read some material on this by Derek Hansen when it comes to rehab and strength training, and he seemed to say that it was very much a case by case thing where sometimes he saw some great returns, sometimes he didn't, and
with stim.
With stim specifically, and then even with stim itself, 2 people with the same quote unquote need might need a completely different stim profile, if that's even a thing. Is that something that you found as well, or is there some consistent landmarks that you're able to maybe replicate every time?
Absolutely. So the first thing is just to clarify, and I know your audience is probably more in the strength and conditioning world and maybe not seeing patients as a primary care entry. And that's Derek's world. So like I said, I know Derek well. We've shared beers together. He's a friend. Derek is not a clinician, right? So he's speaking probably to a hamstring strain or to right? There isn't anyone that comes in that I've seen as a bad case for stim unless they have one of the contraindications for stim, right? So that they don't like it would be the first one, right?
So simple.
I mean, it's like needling or anything else, right? If I don't like it, it's a cool tool, but patient doesn't like it. We see a lot of times if there's excessive fat around an area, all it does is just prickle them, and we've got some pretty vasovagal responses because it's more like we can't get a stim. So you need to be a little leaner for sure. And then, again, these aren't contraindications, probably relative. If you have some sort of electrical device in your system, we try to not push electricity through the body. Those 2 probably aren't correlative, but I just try to be smart. Like I don't want I don't need to stim someone so badly that I want them to come back and tell me that their pacemaker is a problem now because we did this. But otherwise, we stim a lot of people. So, and we stim in function, and we'll stim for 40 minutes at a time sometimes through function. So
and
stim a lot.
You talked about the lower leg and the foot that they use this on. Is that something you would use on glutes as well?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
And especially when the pain inhibition or the weakness is such that the fatigue happens too quickly that they get shearing into the hip joint. So they're, re-irritating a bursa or something like that. And or they start to recruit in their back, and they're there to see you for a back problem. The last thing you want is the rehab to be something that irritates the back. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, so we use that a lot.
Okay. And then foot strength now, and I can just imagine, I mean, it's not that I've never realized it before, but just talking about it now makes you think about folks that love running and that spend so much time either on the road or even in the grass or other. And how strong is that thing that you're pounding into the ground, hundreds and thousands of
usually
things.
Not very well, because the shoe, and many times the shoe is a counter like this. So it's already sort of, you rock through it.
Yeah.
So the toes are already disengaged, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Are they shoes in your, and I'm sure every shoe is different, but are there shoes or brands that are, making way in the design of the shoe? I know there's all the, elastic recoil and how much energy can you put back into the road. The Breaking 2 project comes to mind. But in terms of, I'm not sure how to frame that, the shoes that are good for the foot and that allow us to use the feet in the way that the feet is supposed to work. How's that?
Yeah. So, and I think that's a great question. I think the problem is most people's feet don't work. So I don't think it becomes about like shoe comfort, right? Because even an orthotic, I'm not opposed to them. I fit people in them occasionally. We know they do create a little bit of maybe intrinsic foot weakness. Just strengthen your foot with an orthotic. I mean, that's the solution, because the orthotic may give you tons of results. And as a result, then that just strengthen it. But the shoe needs to fit. And shoe fitting science is such a non-science right now.
What do you mean by
just
that?
Is. Well, I mean that there's no good way to quantify how to fit somebody to a shoe. They've done lots of studies. No. So they've done lots of studies where they 1,000 military recruits and they assign them, independent of foot type, different shoes.
Yeah.
And there's a few commonalities. What you found is the group that got assigned the most controlling shoe had the highest rate of injury. So what we know is a stability shoe is probably the last shoe we want to put somebody in.
When you say stability shoe, is it a very stiff shoe? Is it a shoe?
Yeah, it has a medial heel counter, so it's trying to control pronation. They're a little more robust in their build. They're harder and harder to find because the market has gone towards really high stack heights, like Hoka's and these kind of things, which aren't stability shoes. So we like to put someone in a neutral shoe, fits their toe box. But when you look at fitting, one of the key components, at least in some research, is how the heel fits.
Okay.
And Ben O'Nig, who's a researcher in Calgary, although he's still researching, he's supposed to retire, but he produces a ton of great lower leg and foot research out of his lab. He did some muscle tuning stuff and trying to tune a shoe to the individual. And let's be clear, who set the 2 hour?
Kipchoge?
Thank you. His shoe is uniquely tuned to him. Let's be clear. It wasn't tuned to me or you. And what I mean is the foam density, the carbon plates, they were all probably different for his weight, right? But Nig sort of ultimately showed that you could tune something that's just ridiculously time consuming. Sort of his argument was, well, it should be comfortable. So for us, it's like, if you put a shoe on and think you can get used to it, it's probably not the right shoe. If you put a shoe on and immediately feel like this is comfortable, then that's probably your nervous system telling you that's a good thing, right?
If the shoe fits.
It does. I mean, I hate to say it, right? So it's about it fits, a good heel counter.
I like that we're revisiting some
right.
sayings.
Totally. The ankle's connected to the knee. The other component is, and this is some interesting research, is if you're a less elite runner, then a heel drop sort of between, let's say, 0 to 6% seems to be better. 6 millimeters, I'm sorry.
Okay.
But for more elite runners, it seems like a higher heel to toe offset is better.
Do you have an idea why?
I don't. It might simply be I don't. It might be possibly where they land on the shoe, but there is some thoughts that as those runners fatigue at the high speeds, and this is one of the benefits of this foam technology and these carbon plates is they might shift from, most people are heel strikers, but let's say these high elite guys are more midfoot, not always, but sometimes. That as they fatigue, they might shift to a heel strike, and the dampening nature of having a bigger offset and that foam seems to actually create more of a less problems. In fact, they show less metabolic, consuming less metabolic. Exactly. In that shoe. So for us, it's usually about fit. It's about a neutral shoe. And it's then the idea that, what kind of runner are you? And we can sort of maybe decide what sort of shoe you might want to be in from a heel to toe offset.
Is there, I guess people come to see you, they usually have a specific issue that they want to deal with. When you send them back out, you said usually the rehab is not intense enough. Do you have other practical examples of things that you might do in a rehab setting that are maybe not conventional from an intensity standpoint?
Yeah, so there are ways in which we can leverage other parts of the brain, right? So, I mean, some simple things, because again, patients, we can be much more complicated in the office, right? Because they're here, but the issue is always if they do it here and they can't do it at home, or they're going to screw it up at home. We don't want that.
Yeah.
But we know that even just fixation, so staring at a dot, is going to ramp up the frontal lobe.
Okay.
And so having them fixate. There's some really interesting work by originally, I think, Ebony Rio, looking at a metronome to isometrics, but stimulating the cerebellum so we can have a metronome going to try to get more cerebellar input to that side. We can do certain eye movements because we know that, and the brain is never this black and white, right? But if I have a right-sided issue and I think there's some cerebellar stuff and I want to drive that more aggressively, then when I pursue to the right, if I pursue to the left, that's my left brain, but right cerebellum. So in theory, I could
can you break this down pursuits a little bit, please?
Well, so if you just look at the circuitry of how the eye movements go, and again, nothing is quite one side or the other, but if you look at the parietal lobe initiates the pursuit on the same side that you pursue to.
Okay.
And then if you draw in the downward into the nuclei, 3, 4, and 6 in the midbrain and pons that control the horizontal eye movements, when you draw in the nuclei, what you realize is you cross over, and most of it's initiated from the right cerebellum to pursue left. So if you then start to understand some of that circuitry, you can say, if I want to leverage that a little bit, I could add leftward pursuits to a right body motion if it's if I want to drive that side cerebellum. Okay. So these are things we can then integrate into to stack, right, neural inputs, so that we now hopefully are getting a better information into the nervous system.
Yeah, when you talked about, did you use the word fixating or staring or?
Yeah, gaze holding, fixation.
Holding. And can you expand a little bit on that? What does it bring, and in what context do you use it?
Yeah, so what there's some interesting research about scientists. It's just that it's frontal lobe to hold fixation, right? And fixation is really important, obviously, because we need to be able to keep our eyes still, right? But what we know is if we do gaze holding with an isometric, for example, that we're gonna stimulate similar parts of the brain. So we can leverage that as well. And so there are lots of these little leverage points to try to work on things that if we want, right? And again, we try to read the patient. And there are others. We used a lot of dynamic tape. And other things to see if we can't just ramp up information from that side of the body. So for example, if I have a left side shoulder, we know that the shoulder is input is really close to the same side vestibular input. And so if I have someone with some neck pain, let's say, and they might have a vestibular issue, like post-concussion, these kind of things, and we see that it's more left-sided in the vestibular function, then I could theoretically take the shoulder on that side and drive more input to that side while we then do shoulder rehab or neck rehab. And so there's ways in which we can just piggyback these things to create a more robust change.
How do you know when someone doesn't need to see you anymore?
Yeah, it's a good question. I usually sign people up for 100 visit plans. No, I'm just kidding. This
podcast is going to be great publicity for you.
Right. Totally. So we were teaching in Australia, this functional neuro orthopedic rehab, and I teach with a physical therapist, the lower extremity part. And he always makes fun of me and my model. And he pretends I never work and that I charge a ton and that, patients. Yeah. So the humor is, by the end of the weekend, no one has any idea what I really do or how much and it's like, because I just play into it. The thought process is, as it relates to when somebody doesn't need to see me anymore. In a perfect world, we're able to take them into then Spiral Tiger, Moxie, all that stuff that we like to do. And we try to integrate some of that early on. I like to make a lifetime patient. The reality is I tell people, I hope that they're a lifetime patient and that they're referring their friends in, but they're out doing the things they love to do and they know when to come in and see me. So the reality is, as somebody is, the problem is it's usually not a decision I'm making. Someone's out of pain, they're out the door. I hate to put it that way, but most people
is that usually too soon?
It's sorry, I'm getting a note from someone. I apologize.
No, take it. If you need 5 seconds, take them.
No, it's just that it looks like a patient arrived who wasn't on the schedule.
Okay. So we won't be too long. That was my last question.
So question was
when people leave when they're out of pain, is that usually too soon?
I think so, absolutely, because we can change pain many times in the initial visit. So, and then if you think about just for a minute that motor physiology, we're learning to change the brain, but we're also recruiting new motor units, right? And hypertrophy comes because we recruit most of them and now we can hypertrophy them, right? And so a lot of times we don't get past the motor recruitment phase, right?
I see. Yeah. So
because you can only get so strong with a band.
You get.
I'm not. Look, I know a lot about SNC and hypertrophy. I use Moxie on people. We train people. Don't believe I don't know how to go there.
Of course.
But you can only get so strong with the band. So
no, that makes sense, Doc. We're gonna keep it here for today. There was
I apologize.
Don't be. That's a great excuse to get you on again soon to talk about all the other great things that I had on the list here. Moxie, said Spiral Tiger, Neuroxon system, breathing. I want to talk to you about philosophy and coaching too. So I think we have a lot more to go over.
I'd love to come back. I like I said, enjoy your podcast. I think they're great.
Thanks, man.
And I think, one of these days we can sort of get into how breathing and the neck and back and that relationship there, because I know we talk about it in performance, but not always in sort of our day-to-day Gen Pop.
So I definitely want to go there. So you will be back on the podcast in not so long. Thanks so much for coming on, Doc. Where can people find out about you if they want?
Awesome. If people want to learn more, you can go on. We have a website called Denver Running Solutions, and
it's in the show notes.
Go
click on it.
Exactly, and shoot me an email through that. I love talking to people. I love building community. I know you've done a wonderful job of that. So. And so I really appreciate having me on. It's been great.
It's been a great pleasure, Doc, and looking forward to the next one. Take care.
Thanks, Sean.